The overture to a tragedy. Every now and then a story erupts from the quiet corners of life, tearing apart the illusions of peace we so tenderly build. It starts not with thunder or chaos, but with subtle, almost imperceptible cracks, a strange silence where laughter used to linger, an empty gaze across a dinner table, or a haunting melody echoing through an otherwise ordinary neighborhood. You feel the tension before you understand it. The atmosphere thickens with possibilities, some real, some conjured by imagination. I remember the media storm that swirled across the United States years ago, sparked by a case that defied logic and polarized public opinion. People gave it a name spoken with a mix of fear and fascination, the never-ending case. It became a symbol, an emblem of the uncertainty that can shroud the truth, even in a world obsessed with evidence and justice. The newspapers cried out for answers, talk shows dissected every scrap of rumor, and neighbors lowered their voices once the sun dipped below the horizon, as if afraid the darkness might overhear. This wasn't merely the story of a crime, it was a tale where every piece of evidence seemed to spiral inwards, refusing to settle on a single, undeniable answer. For those caught in its web, reality itself began to twist, becoming a labyrinth of suspicion and yearning. The community, once tied together by block parties and PTA meetings, now eyed each other with a quiet, growing mistrust. Had a monster always been in their midst, masked by a smile and a wave? Or was this simply the kind of nightmare that could happen anywhere, to anyone? Even I, recounting the details all these years later, feel a chill when I close my eyes. I hear the distant echo of a piano in an empty home. I see old houses standing silent beneath the southern sky, their secrets locked away with the coming night. And in the center of it all, a question that refuses to die. Did fate script this tragedy with cold determinism from the start, or did a single choice push everything over the edge? Welcome to the elusive beginning of an American tragedy, where the truth hides behind layers of shadow, and what you think you know is only the faint overture before the real story begins. Setting: a peaceful land beneath whispering storms. Nestled in the southeastern corner of the United States is a place that's easy to miss on the map, but impossible to forget once you've breathed its air. The state, proud but modest in size, was one of the earliest to join the Union. A patchwork of small towns, endless green farmland, winding rivers, and forests whose ancient canopies have kept secrets for centuries. It's the sort of landscape where people talk about roots, and mean not just family, but the very soil they work, hunt, and live on. The heartbeat of this place is the town of Oglethorpe, a name as old as some of the oaks that line its country roads. Less than 1,200 souls call Oglethorpe home, and though stranger is a word rarely heard, everyone seems to know everyone else by scent and stride as much as by name. The air here is heavier with summer humidity and gossip, both thick, lingering, sometimes oppressive. At first glance, Oglethorpe is the sort of town built for postcards and nostalgia. Main Street is flanked by mom-and-pop diners, a single movie theater that still runs matinees, and battered mailboxes that have seen generations come and go. There's the annual Sunflower Festival each July, county fairs where everyone's pie is a secret family recipe, and Friday night football games that leave the streets deserted. Children race after fireflies while elders sit on porches and trade stories so tangled in local legend, you'd be forgiven for not knowing what's fact and what's folklore. The land yields riches too, with cotton fields that ripple like a white sea in the wind, soybean farms, and thick pine woods that, at dusk, seem to swallow the world whole. Agriculture keeps the town alive, and cattle, more numerous than some family lines, graze silently in the heat. Here, local pride is matter of fact. The Coca-Cola bottling plant that set up shop decades ago is as much part of the scenery as the old Baptist church or the water tower with its cheerful sun-faded mural. But Oglethorpe, for all its light, was never immune to shadow. Beneath its surface, old grudges were tucked away like keepsakes in a dresser drawer. Outsiders sometimes spoke of the county's insularity, of how it could turn against its own when suspicion rippled through the grass. After all, in a place where everyone knows everyone, a secret is just a rumor waiting for a reason. It is in this context that the coming tragedy rooted itself. Those who call this land home learned long ago to trust what they see, but they also know that the loveliest landscapes can host storms that gather out of sight, and that peace sometimes is only the mask that calm wears before the thunder breaks. The welder with the strange passion. Behind the faded blue door of a modest house on the edge of town dwelled Dak Benton, a man most would notice immediately, but few could claim to truly understand. At 38 years old, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with arms marbled by years of manual labor, and a posture that dominated any room he entered. He was the kind of man deli counters welcomed first on busy mornings, whose nod was as good as a handshake, and whose presence always quieted a crowd. Yet beneath that physical strength, Dak harbored a heart attuned to quirks often overlooked by those less observant or less patient. His life split in two. By day, he ran a small welding shop, a haven for locals who needed gates fixed, tractors reborn, or iron fences built tough enough to withstand both weather and mischief. The tang of molten metal followed him wherever he went, as did his reputation for precision and stubborn honesty. Despite a steady demand for his skill, money in Dak's world seemed to vanish as quickly as it came. Neighbors gossiped about his curious financial situation, never quite able to reconcile his apparent success with the simplicity of his life. For the answer, one only had to step inside Dak's home, a universe as eccentric as its master. Dozens upon dozens of cages hung from the beams, perched on makeshift tables, and lined every window ledge. Inside each, parrots from every corner of the world chattered and sang, their plumage flashing emerald, sapphire, or fiery scarlet in the sunlight that filtered through smudged glass. Dak's passion for rare parrots bordered on obsession. Where other men collected classic cars or antique guns, he sketched bird pedigrees in spiral notebooks and learned to mimic their calls with uncanny accuracy. Every morning, neighbors woke not only to the rooster's crow but to the uncanny chorus that spilled from his living room windows. To Dak, tending his feathered companions was no ordinary hobby. It required meticulous planning, vast patience, and a devotion that bordered on reverence. Visitors remarked that the birds were not just pets but extensions of his soul, creatures he protected, understood, and perhaps valued more than most humans. Yet joy rarely lingers unchallenged. Dak's singular focus and the pungent soundtrack of his daily life drove a wedge between him and his wife, who left one autumn day, unable to share a home with so much noise and so little conversation. In her place, a son, quiet but bright-eyed. The two Bentons became a team, the father, weathered but resilient, the son, a sensitive observer always one step out of step with his peers. Their home was filled with the clang of dumbbells, the rustle of birdseed, and the kind of love that speaks softly even in the loudest of places. Outside that sanctuary, Dak was a puzzle left unsolved. His hulking frame belied an inner gentleness, his silence a troubled wisdom. He spent his free time not seeking crowds or companionship, but patching up cages, charting the inherited quirks of his avian flock, or perfecting his bench press for no audience except his own reflection in a dusty gym mirror. He seemed content, or at least reconciled to his lot. Perhaps it was loneliness that clung to him like metallic dust, but Dak bore it with a stoic patience that earned him quiet respect, and a certain wariness from those who considered themselves ordinary. After all, in a town where everyone knows your story, it is the details unspoken that so often become legend. A fateful encounter. It rarely begins with grand gestures or the sort of fireworks worthy of legend. Sometimes destiny tiptoes quietly through the back door of mundane life. A chance encounter at the supermarket, a crackling radio on a rain-washed evening, the accidental slip of a coffee cup that leads to an apology, and the very first joke. For Dak Benton, this twist of fate arrived one dusky September afternoon. He was hunched over a crate of birdseed at Marvin's Feed and Supply, sweat marking the seams of his flannel shirt, when he heard the unmistakable timbre of authority softened by fatigue. "You know that stuff is murder on your back if you try to carry it alone." Chelsea Forson rarely blended into the background anywhere she went, a trait that was, for better or worse, both her armor and Achilles' heel. Newly promoted to deputy police chief, her sharp-featured face managed always to wobble between a smirk and a challenge. Chelsea's presence was electric, her posture straight-backed and confident, her eyes cool but warm around the edges, as if daring the world to do its worst while quietly hoping maybe, just this once, it wouldn't. Fresh from a messy divorce and single motherhood, she carried herself with an ease honed by years of walking a tightrope in a men's world. That afternoon, while the air held the promise of rain, their lives, so different and yet oddly parallel, knotted together over sacks of seed and the heavy, awkward silence between two people suddenly aware of each other. There was none of the nervousness of youthful crushes, nor the reckless intensity of whirlwind romances. It was something slower, a sidelong glance that lingered a beat too long, a recognition beneath the surface. Here was another soul marked by loss, carved by persistence, fighting to anchor themselves against currents too strong to swim alone. Outside, the town's only traffic light blinked amber, and the world pressed on with its ordinary business, unaware, as always, when the extraordinary breached its routine. Dak helped load Chelsea's car. She offered a wry "Thanks, stranger," as a smile flickered between them. He learned her name, and she learned to recognize the laugh lines that softened his wrestler's brow. But a connection forged by happenstance can be as profound as any storm. Their conversations grew from transactional to confessional. Chelsea, after years of keeping herself guarded, found herself telling Dak about her daughter, her struggles with loneliness, and battles with a police department still blindsided by her ambition. Dak spoke of his birds and the odd, gentle ache of a marriage that had crumbled not from betrayal, but from quiet, growing distance. He didn't apologize for who he was, or for loving creatures many regarded as little more than noisy decor. Over time, what began as a string of fleeting exchanges snowballed into moonlit walks on empty streets, cups of coffee balanced between work shifts, and silent understanding only those with many scars could intuit. Neither Dak nor Chelsea moved quickly. They were hesitant, wary of hurting or being hurt, but each step they took was deliberate. Trust was built, not assumed. The people of Oglethorpe watched curiously, a tale of two misfits finding solace together, or perhaps just a pair of storm-battered souls sheltering under the same awning while the world's thunder rolled on. In retrospect, every story has its hinge moment, the scene on which the rest of the narrative pivots. For Dak and Chelsea, this meeting was it, the silent spark that set their fates forever on a shared, unpredictable course. Storms approach in silence. The quiet spell that had settled over Oglethorpe unraveled not with sirens or the glare of police lights, but with something far more insidious, a silence that felt wrong. In the weeks following the first gentle spark between Dak Benton and Chelsea Forson, the town learned that even the most tranquil days could be harbingers of coming storms. There was a pregnant stillness to the air, the kind you only notice when your senses sharpen in anticipation of the unknown. It started with little things. A neighbor noticed that Dak's work truck hadn't moved for days, the dust thickening across its windshield and the trash bins at the side of the house left uncollected, birds hopping about in search of the scattered seeds Dak always spread for them but never finding any. The morning chorus, once a riot of parrot calls and cheerful aggression, faded to a somber hush. The parrots grew restless, their cages less tended, the sharp colors of their feathers dulled by neglect. Even the neighbors' dogs, usually riled by the ceaseless noise, seemed subdued, as if they too knew something had disrupted the sacred routine of their world. Rumors spread quickly in Oglethorpe. Some whispered that Dak had gone out of town on sudden business, others theorized that he was simply taking time for himself. But the longer his absence stretched, the more outlandish the stories became. The old men outside the diner leaned back in their chairs, murmuring about debts unpaid or a falling out with his ex-wife. The mailman, an unofficial barometer for anything unusual, noted the accumulation of unclaimed envelopes and the eerily quiet home. In some ways, Dak's disappearance seemed impossible, the kind of bizarre happening that shouldn't ever mar the calm fabric of a small, interconnected town. "People don't just vanish out here," one neighbor muttered. "If something did happen to him, it was planned, or hidden." The reality hit hard and fast. After 3 days with still no sign of Dak, a neighbor grew worried and knocked at the blue door. No answer. The odor, sharp and unnatural, drifted from the windowsills. The neighbor called the sheriff's office, her voice trembling as she tried not to alarm Dak's son, who was due to return from staying with relatives. The responding deputy let himself in, stepping over scattered husks of sunflower seeds, and entered a scene that felt surreal in its stillness. Inside, chaos had overtaken the once meticulous order. The parrots shrieked with hunger, many slumping against their cages, some tragically lifeless. The air was stifling with the smell of feathers, spilled seed, and something fouler. Dak, the one person who had never missed a feeding, would never have let this happen, not out of forgetfulness, not ever from neglect. The sight stiffened the deputy's spine. He radioed for backup. The Benton residence was quickly cordoned off and the investigation began in earnest. Across town, Chelsea Forson was on duty at the sheriff's office, her mind fractured between the demands of her badge and the gnawing anxiety she had felt growing over the past several days. In her private thoughts, memories of her last conversation with Dak flashed by in fragments, the plans they'd half made, the teasing banter in the parking lot outside Marvin's Feed and Supply. She tried to call him. No answer. As the hours slipped by, an escalating dread built inside her, settling sharp and cold in her gut. News of Dak's disappearance rippled through Oglethorpe. Some faces greeted Chelsea with wary sympathy, others with suspicion, the shadow of her outsider status always hovering at the edges. Each phone call and knock at the door chipped away at her composure. Had they fought? Was there trouble between them? Chelsea's every move was scrutinized, her voice analyzed for hints of guilt or sorrow, but inside she knew she was as baffled and frightened as anyone else. The line between professional and personal blurred painfully as she was questioned about her relationship with Dak, their routines, and her whereabouts in recent days. The investigation quickly grew complicated. Officers combed the house and property, cataloging every bit of evidence: muddy boot prints, a glove stained with what might be old oil or something darker, a patch of carpet ripped and scrubbed as if erasing a stubborn stain. In the refrigerator, a half-eaten pie and wilted greens, a testament to abruptly interrupted domesticity. The parrots were transported to the home of a local bird lover while detectives scoured every inch of the property. The case was classified as a missing person at first, though suspicion and whispers eyed something far more sinister. The Bentons' closest neighbors, long familiar with Dak's routines, provided statements that baffled as much as they clarified. He had been seen late on the evening of June 4th, taking out the trash, whistling to his birds, nothing out of the ordinary. No one reported hearing a struggle, a gunshot, or any other sign of violence, but the walls of old houses sometimes concealed more than they revealed. The sheriff's deputies canvassed nearby farms, checked traffic cameras, and pulled the phone records. Nothing conclusive emerged, only more confusion. Chelsea was placed on administrative leave pending inquiry, a necessary evil, but to her it felt like exile. She spent her days living on coffee and adrenaline, barely sleeping, alternately pacing her living room and staring blankly at the phone. The scrutiny ate at her: gossips in the market, sideways glances during church service, children silenced by their mothers when she passed. She felt the cage of a community closing in, the slight but unmistakable distance growing between her and those who had once called her friend. Complicating matters, Dak's ex-wife returned to town, face drawn and haunted as she answered questions no spouse should ever face. Was there trouble? Did Dak have enemies, debts, old grudges? Her answers echoed the town's uncertainty. The investigation deepened, drawing in state investigators and eventually reporters, their vans lining the roads, their presence altering the rhythm of Oglethorpe in ways that would leave scars for years. Days bled into nights. The hope that Dak might harmlessly walk through his blue door grew fainter and fainter. The unspoken fear that something irreversible had happened became the new reality. As police tape fluttered in the humid summer air, Oglethorpe's collective innocence slipped away. They understood, finally and tragically, that no place, no matter how shrouded in tradition, how fiercely it protected its own, was truly immune to the storms that brew in silence. Cement trough and the unidentified odor. The summer sun had already begun to lose its intensity, dipping behind the pale haze of distant treetops, when the first clue, a clue that would upend everything, crept quietly into the consciousness of Oglethorpe's townsfolk. For nearly 2 weeks the search for Dak Benton had grown increasingly desperate. Flyers were posted in every window, daily rumors flared around the diner's chipped countertops, children whispered theories too dark for their age as they passed the silent shuttered Benton house. Hope, once stubborn, began to surrender to the oppressive, unspeakable fear that everyone shared, but none were brave enough to voice. It was on the 13th morning, as the dew still clung to the ragged edges of the pasture grass, that a cattle rancher named Vern Wilkins lifted his nose at something off about the breeze. At first he tried to blame it on the usual suspects: stagnant pond water, a bloated coyote hidden in brush, the leftover rot from last week's thunderstorm. But the odor would not be ignored. It wafted heavier and stranger with every gust, almost elemental in its horror, settling an unease deep in his bones. Cows, normally so placid, bunched along the opposite fence line, moaning low and uneasy. Following the scent, Vern crossed through gnarled patches of muscadine vine, his boots collecting clay and sticky clods. The source revealed itself at the far end of his property, a long gray livestock trough, tipped awkwardly beside a disused corral. There was something all wrong about it, the way weeds bent away as if by instinct, the ring of scorched, dead grass curling from its base, and that smell, enveloping everything, a sickening blend of chemical sharpness and organic decay. Pausing, Vern called for his farmhand. They clustered near the trough's rim, exchanged glances and finally, as one might peel back a shroud, prized away the warped blue tarp that had been stretched over half the vessel. The slick surface of concrete was the first thing they saw, a rough, uneven slab hurriedly poured to seal whatever lurked beneath. And from a jagged fissure where the mixture hadn't quite set, the stench leapt out in full, complete and unmistakable. Panic and disgust crashed over Vern. He barely managed to mutter that it was a job for the police, stumbling back and blinking away the bile that rose in his throat. It didn't take long for squad cars to encircle the property, red and blue lights flickering eerily amid the waving grass. The site quickly became a stage of whispered orders and somber nods, detectives donning gloves and masks, the county coroner straightening his tie with mechanical focus. The Benton case, once fogged by speculation, now seethed with grim, undeniable reality. The crowd watched from a respectful but insatiable distance as investigators chipped, then hammered away at the haphazard concrete cap. The odor grew almost unbearable, causing even the battle-hardened to swallow hard and turn their faces to the merciful wind. Each movement of the chisel exposed more, first a patch of fabric, then a limp, powder-white hand, fingers outstretched in frozen supplication. Gasps rippled through the air. Under a gray southern sky, the trough yielded its secret, a body, curled and shattered, death's signature scrawled across every inch. Dak Benton had been found. The violence was unmistakable, a gunshot wound blackening his chest like some cruel, purposeful mark, blunt force trauma splayed across his collarbone. The remains were dressed in the torn, familiar flannel that Oglethorpe had last seen over Dak's shoulders. Nearby, woven into the cropped grass, lay a single brass shell casing and the muddy treads of tires, the sort of clues that tell lies as much as truths. News of the discovery fanned out with the force of prairie fire. The blue house with its silent aviary now became a place of pilgrimage, then of horror. Mourners arrived with trembling hands to leave plastic-wrapped flowers on the porch. Children huddled on their bikes at the edge of the police tape, trying not to cry. No one spoke of miracles anymore. The world had made its declaration, hard and final. Investigators worked in a frenzy that blurred day into night. Forensics teams sliced away the chunk of concrete, revealing more evidence sealed into the makeshift mausoleum. There were duct-taped seams along the body, a length of stained curtain gathered near Dak's feet, and a set of cheap work gloves, brand new, tags hastily torn off. A sledgehammer, carved with initials that no one could quite place, was found discarded in the brush a few yards away. The details coalesced into a narrative, but one that raised as many questions as it answered. Was this the work of a frenzied moment or a meticulously crafted plan? And who, among the faces in Oglethorpe, would have mustered the strength, let alone the cruelty, to see it through? One detail haunted everyone. Atop the cracked windshield of Dak's abandoned pickup truck, found only a mile from the Wilkins Ranch, rested a note. Written in blocky, unfamiliar print it read, "He got what he deserved." The handwriting did not match Dak's, nor anyone the investigators could easily identify. The very presence of the note fanned the gossip mill to fever pitch, each new theory darker and more tangled than the last. Through it all, the scent from the trough, the stinging, unforgettable perfume of concrete and rot, permeated everything. It crept into the nostrils and dreams of everyone who came near, a physical reminder of horror that refused to dissipate. Even after the trough was hauled away, its memory lingered, forever a part of the land and the story that Oglethorpe would never be able to shake. Inside town limits, the revelation shattered any illusion that justice was simple or clean. Detectives pored over receipts, surveillance tapes, and hardware store ledgers, searching for anyone who might have purchased cement, gloves, or a tarp in the critical window. Neighbors racked their brains over odd noises in the night, unfamiliar taillights flickering on rural backroads, or the fleeting scent of gasoline under their noses. Every tiny recollection, once meaningless, now seemed laced with danger. Everyone questioned not only their neighbors, but, in bleak moments, themselves. Most chilling of all, the forensic team reported that the timeline didn't quite fit. The cement had been poured before it had fully cured, leaving traces of something else beneath. A torn strip of paper, traces of perfume, and fragments of black hair. Each clue sent the case careening in a new direction. Motive, opportunity, and deepest resentment bled together, painting a world where even the familiar was suspect. For Chelsea Forson, the discovery was brutal in its clarity and its ambiguity. Standing on the edge of the crime scene, she watched the investigators as if through a pane of glass, her badge heavy as lead in her pocket. She relived every recent interaction with Dak, the half-joking promises, the worried silences, the moments when she'd caught him staring through the window as if watching something ominous approach. With the arrival of Dak's ex-wife in town, old wounds split wide, questions outnumbered reassurances. Was this a vendetta, an accident, or something darker that snaked through the past seeking atonement or revenge? As the night drew in, and the world narrowed to the harsh glare of police floodlights, a profound helplessness settled over everyone. Oglethorpe's sense of safety, its proud foundation of shared trust, seemed to sink beneath the heavy weight of the concrete trough. The story of one man's death had become a scar, stitched into the earth by the smell of fear and the echo of unanswered questions. Living in that shadow, all anyone could do was wonder who among them had chosen to burden their hands, and the land itself, with such an unspeakable secret. Investigation Vortex. Traces leading only one way. The investigation that rippled through Oglethorpe was as relentless as an oncoming storm, cold, methodical, and impossible to outrun. For the townspeople, the death of Dak Benton was a wound. For the authorities, it was a puzzle fraught with both passion and pressure. As yellow tape fluttered in the heavy air, every detail from the macabre scene was combed over again and again. There was no time for sentiment. Only the truth, however ugly, would suffice. It began with the physical evidence gathered from the Wilkins Ranch, from Dak's house, and from the battered pickup truck left to rust in the shoulder-high weeds. Investigators meticulously cataloged the curtain remnant found tangled near the concrete trough, comparing its pattern with household linens from the Benton residence. The shower curtain from Dak's bathroom was missing, its abrupt absence impossible to overlook. Next, they pored over receipts unearthed from a heap of unsorted mail and kitchen drawers. The purchase of a livestock trough, several bags of quick-dry cement, and rubber gloves stood out, their transaction dates lining up in that fleeting window between Dak's last known sighting and the first notes of alarm. They dusted for fingerprints, hoping for clarity, but the prints were smeared. A single partial matched to Chelsea Forson, which investigators quickly explained. She'd helped with home repairs, had been in the house countless times, and the farm supply store's security cameras quietly corroborated her presence in the days prior. None of this was evidence of guilt on its own, but as pressures mounted, the pieces started to click together. Or so it seemed. Forensics teams worked around the clock. Swabs taken from the cement trough revealed traces of perfume, a signature neither feminine nor strong enough to belong to a working man. Strands of dark hair, too short and fine for Dak himself, were twisted into the duct-taped seam. Each new result narrowed the scope of possibility, but also intensified the glare of suspicion. Meanwhile, investigators worked the neighborhood. Old friends and nervous acquaintances were questioned, their answers chronicled and measured for inconsistency. Several witnesses placed Chelsea's car near the Wilkins property on the fateful week. One claimed to have heard the sound of a vehicle idling late at night near the direction of the trough, but when pressed, their details wavered. Night can play tricks on memory, and Oglethorpe's fields were thick with secrets and shadows. Any sense of certainty was as fragile as smoke, and yet the narrative tightened its grip nevertheless. The unraveling of Chelsea's alibi was slow, but inexorable. She insisted she'd spent those crucial hours with her daughter at home. However, calls to her phone went unanswered, message timestamps mismatched, and inconsistencies in her account began piling up. A forensic search of her car revealed minor traces of potting soil and grass clippings, a plausible enough oversight for any rural resident. But in this context, every innocent detail became pregnant with implication. And then there was the mounting pressure from above. The case had captured the regional press, the interested eyes of state law enforcement, and the public, half awed, half brutal, demanded accountability. Somebody has to pay, the headlines seemed to insist, the appetite for justice undiminished by nuance or doubt. Chelsea's prior reputation, her career milestones, and her enemies within the department all came to bear. The suggestion that her fight against workplace harassment had bred resentment only deepened the fog of suspicion swirling around her. Rumors and half-truths swirled through Oglethorpe like dust devils in a drought. Every old slight or moment of friction between Chelsea and her colleagues, some trivial, others deeply personal, was raked up and pulled apart. The investigation took on a momentum of its own. A notebook here, a digital calendar there, Chelsea's name at the hardware counter on the day when duct tape and gloves were rung up by an absent-minded cashier. Those with a grudge seized their moment to whisper. Yet, for all the supposed clarity, troubling inconsistencies haunted the investigators. The weight of Dak's body, the logistics of dragging a grown man and hauling him into the trough, These feats needed strength and time, more than a single person would manage easily, especially without leaving more of a trace. The neighbors remembered nothing out of the ordinary. No loud arguments, no frantic shouts carrying through the humid air. How had the act unfolded, methodically or in a fit of rage masked by later calculation? Chelsea was forced into an agonizing limbo. She was ordered to surrender her badge and placed on administrative leave, her gun and uniforms boxed up and taken from the house under the eyes of watchful deputies. Her home became a fortress of solitude and suspicion, the phone ringing at all hours with terse interviews and quiet accusations. Sleep came less and less. Her daughter, once shielded from the worst of Oglethorpe's gossip, began to shrivel under the pressure. Classmates whispered, friends withdrew. Chelsea's world, which had once seemed capable of withstanding any storm, now collapsed inward one unsteady inch at a time. Evidence, damning but ultimately circumstantial, accumulated like the southern heat. Scratches on Chelsea's arms were explained away as gardening accidents, the lingering scent of bleach at her house attributed to a week-long binge of cleaning, though no one could remember her as the tidy sort. She failed a routine polygraph, nerves shattering her steadiness, grimacing through question after question posed by investigators who, weeks earlier, had called her colleague and friend. The prosecution began to build a castle out of inferences, a timeline mapped with the clinical precision of a surgeon, a motive born from bottled-up rage or alternatively, cold calculation. Her lawyer countered with the argument that police bias, a byproduct of gender, office politics, and the town's thirst for closure, was steering the investigation toward a single, convenient answer. But as state analysts reconstructed the sequence of purchases, travel logs, phone pings, and witness statements, it was as if the facts themselves refused to let Chelsea fully escape the shadow now cast across her life. Days blurred into weeks, each bringing new revelations, leaks to the press, and emotional testimonies. Chelsea's every movement, past and present, became a matter for public dissection. Even her advocacy work, celebrated at first, was now twisted into a narrative of troublemaker or outsider. In small towns where legacy matters more than truth, the court of public opinion roared louder than any police siren. Behind the scenes, the case baffled even the most seasoned detectives. Every hard lead seemed to double back on itself. The handwriting on the "he got what he deserved" note found on Dak's windshield did not match Chelsea nor anyone in the immediate circle. Still, the nature of the evidence appeared arranged, almost too perfectly. Camera footage of unfamiliar trucks passing through the area around the time in question went unexplained, and 2 sets of tire prints near the trough, while similar, could not be conclusively matched to Chelsea's vehicle. Throughout the ordeal, Chelsea's son clung fiercely to her side. Family and a few steadfast friends launched their own version of an investigation, uncovering procedural missteps and pointing out logical gaps in the theory of the crime. If Chelsea was being set up, the job was executed masterfully. The missing minutes, carefully placed clues, and over-eagerness in law enforcement to secure a conviction began to draw whispers of conspiracy. Yet, every new development seemed to push her deeper into the vortex, as if the investigation itself had a will to see her condemned. To the outside observer, the swirl of evidence pointed in only one direction. To those who looked closer, journalists, defense attorneys, and a handful of locals, the direction was almost too straight, as if forcibly guided rather than honestly found. Dak's ex-wife, newly returned to town, wavered between anger and mourning, contributing her own suspicions and further muddying the investigation's waters. Police informants stepped forward with stories of past conflicts, petty grievances, and odd happenings that seemed almost designed to implicate Chelsea, but when pieced together, only clouded the case further. The final piece of the spiral came with the grand jury's decision. In a climate as charged as Oglethorpe's, where frustration with uncertainty burned hot, the mounting pile of circumstantial evidence was enough. Chelsea was indicted, her mugshot broadcast on television, her legacy as a law enforcement officer erased in an instant. The courtroom became an arena for spectacle. Neighbors packed the gallery, their faces painted with curiosity, relief, or quiet despair. During trial, prosecutors painted a picture of betrayal and simmering resentment, contending Chelsea's romantic involvement with Dak had soured dangerously. They pointed to the string of purchases, the odd absences, and inconsistencies in her statements as proof of guilt. The defense countered doggedly, picking apart timelines and motivations. They argued the real killer must have manipulated the crime scene, leveraged Chelsea's vulnerabilities, and played the county's prejudices like a well-tuned guitar. Still, The wheel of justice, once set in motion, has a terrifying inertia. Witnesses remembered only what fit their own bias. Hints of other suspects, an ex-wife with a shadowy alibi, rumors of an old business dispute, anonymous tips about someone spotted on the back roads were deemed coincidence or hearsay. Chelsea, exhausted but unbowed, faced the judgment of both the court and the world beyond its doors. No matter the final verdict, the circle could not be unbroken. In Oglethorpe, the spiral of suspicion, evidence and rumor had led the whole town down a single, fateful path, one that grew narrower, stonier, and more uncertain with every step taken. And as the courthouse emptied each evening into the heavy southern dusk, no one could be sure if justice had truly been served, or if the real story still lay buried, deep beneath the surface, with its own secrets and sorrows waiting to be unearthed. Two testimonies, two fates. In a town like Oglethorpe, truth had always worn the face of whoever spoke loudest or stood tallest. Legacies and rumors had a way of merging until neither could be separated in the daylight. But inside the jury room with its dusty blinds and air tinged with old coffee, the only thing that mattered now was testimony. And testimony, as everyone soon learned, could sound like gospel, or like the opening of a wound, depending on who held the floor. Chelsea Forson sat upright in the creaking wooden chair, the thick coil of courtroom silence pressing in around her. She wore the suit she had saved for the most important occasions, a blazer that no longer hid the stress in her shoulders, pants newly hemmed to distract from the restless tapping of her nerves. Her lawyer's hand rested over hers, steady, but not able to provide the certainty she desperately craved. Outside, the courthouse steps throbbed with the anticipation of a town divided. Some wanted a clean answer, others only wanted the ordeal to end. Chelsea's turn to testify unfolded not as a performance but an act of survival. Her voice was unwavering, though beneath the surface her muscles coiled as tightly as wound springs. She kept her words measured, offering the facts of that night, where she'd been, what she'd done, the small tasks that made up her evening and the urgent phone calls she'd placed to Dak with no answer. Each question from the prosecution felt like a probe, poking not just at inconsistencies but at her very identity, her history in the department, the whispers about her ambition, the rumor-laden traces of discord with male colleagues. When asked about the evidence implicating her, the print at the scene, the receipts, the gloves, she didn't flinch. Her lawyer prompted her to explain everything in full, her history with Dak's son, their shared chores, the kind of trust only built in long silences and old scars. "I had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I loved him," she said softly, a phrase that echoed off the jury box and seemed to hang unanswered in the room. The cross-examination felt colder. Prosecution pressed, framing her as calculating, even manipulative. The implication was simple. Her drive, her break with the old boys club, her very difference, had made her dangerous. They lingered on the failed polygraph, the odd phone records, the lack of a credible alibi for the critical window. Chelsea's face tightened, a flicker of frustration or fear or both. "Isn't it possible," the prosecutor intoned, "that you planned this to look like someone else did it? That all this talk of evidence planted against you is just a smokescreen?" Chelsea shook her head. "No, but it's possible for other people to know what I would do or not do. I've never hidden my life here. Can anyone else say the same?" Before the court, Chelsea wasn't just defending actions, she was fighting for the shape of her own story. She spoke about workplace harassment, about threats that had escalated after she came forward with a tape recorder, a collection of slurs and threats left on her desk in years past. She didn't claim perfection. She simply laid out the mounting dread she lived with, the sense that the powder keg in Oglethorpe had been rattling for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. When Dak's ex-wife took the stand, the mood shifted. Her testimony was colder, more brittle, but carried the simmer and snap of old pain. She described her years married to Dak, his obsessions, his changes after meeting Chelsea, and the mounting distance between their son and his father. She didn't accuse Chelsea directly, but her story filled the air with the sour scent of suspicion. The phone calls that went unanswered, the late-night arguments overheard through paper-thin walls, a single bruised wrist she said was just an accident. Her tone vacillated, sometimes grieving, sometimes angry. Under direct questioning she admitted to resenting Chelsea's presence but denied any motive for harm. "Maybe I did envy what they found together," she said, eyes trained on the scuffed linoleum, "but envy isn't the same as hate. And who could say with all this mess what any of us are truly capable of?" In the back row, Dak's son watched with wide, hollow eyes. He had been called to testify too, his voice the smallest in the room but perhaps the truest. He remembered the arguments, the confusion, the night silence that seemed heavier than ever before. "I just want the truth," he whispered, not for the lawyers but for anyone still able to listen. "My dad and Chelsea, they didn't hurt people, not like this. Someone wants us to think they could, but they wouldn't." The chorus of testimonies continued, colleagues describing Chelsea as tireless but bristling, others claiming she was a troublemaker. A neighbor remembered seeing her car parked at the Benton house late. Another, equally firm, swore he saw someone else lurking in the shadows. A county forensics tech, nervous and sweating, admitted the case didn't quite line up. There were just too many loose threads in the physical evidence, details that felt both damning and muddied depending on who told their version of events. Through expert witnesses, the defense painted the picture of an inside job, deliberate planting of evidence, subtle misdirections, a suspect with access to both the departmental calendar and intel on Chelsea's routines. They raised the question of motive, not just love gone sour, but power, retribution, and the oldest motive of all, jealousy. In closing arguments, Chelsea's lawyer invoked the mosaic of accusation, how a puzzle could be forced into an image it was never meant to create. When every doubt, every slip, every odd coincidence is seen through the lens of guilt, you find what you want, regardless of what's actually there. But the prosecution's final plea reverberated in the packed room. "Trust is fragile," he declared. Miss Forson herself said as much. "If we ignore the evidence, if we accept only what sounds good, we betray the foundation of law and order. Someone must answer for this crime. Every sign points here." In the charged silence that followed, the fates of two people, one accused, one gone, teetered between redemption and ruin. And outside, the town itself felt changed, as if Oglethorpe's heart now thudded not with communal certainty, but with the uneasy pulse of doubt. Two testimonies, two legacies, forever intertwined on the stage of a Southern tragedy. The mountains of doubt grow higher. As the echoes of the courtroom's final gavel faded, Oglethorpe remained far from settled. Instead, the collective conscience of the town seemed to climb an ever-rising mountain of questions. Each summit, instead of bringing clarity, only revealed further fog-shrouded peaks with no end in sight. The neat narrative presented at trial conflicted with the gnawing uncertainty that gnawed at everyone, from the courthouse steps to the furthest outposts of rumor. Doubt had become the new geography of Oglethorpe, its contours ever shifting with every retelling, every whispered theory. Beneath the official story, impeccably constructed and fiercely argued, cracks began to show. Local lawmen wondered out loud in the back corner booths of the diner. Could it really have been so simple? Records and receipts seemed to fit together just a bit too well, as if guided into place by an invisible hand. Some residents quietly pointed out that the shower curtain used in the crime didn't perfectly match the set from Dak's house after all. The missing piece had a subtle stripe, but the curtain wrapped around his battered body was solid, plain beige. A small detail, easily overlooked, but in a mystery where every thread mattered, it was enough for suspicion to linger. The logistics, too, became the subject of heated late-night debate. How could a single perpetrator, no matter how strong or determined, have managed to overpower Dak, haul his massive frame from home to trough, mix and pour concrete, all without drawing a single eye? Why had no dogs barked, no one seen tire tracks or flashes of headlights in the quiet hours? The timeline prosecutors so assiduously mapped left just enough margin for impossibility. "She'd have to be a magician, not just a woman in trouble with the world," muttered old folks who still believed in the town's silent codes and long-forgotten kindnesses. A more troubling inconsistency came from forensics. The bloodstains on the floor of Dak's house, once attributed to the struggle, were found to be mixed with traces of an unidentified substance. Motor oil, maybe, or something stranger. For every piece of physical evidence tying Chelsea to the crime scene, there seemed to be another that begged the question of someone else's involvement, maybe even someone close enough to know both the layout of Dak's life and the minefields of Oglethorpe gossip. Who would have risked framing a deputy, and why? Other doubts began to snowball. The infamous note left on Dak's windshield, block lettering plain as day, remained a cipher. Handwriting experts waffled, unable to conclusively match it to any known sample. The town collided with the paradox. If Chelsea wrote it, why was her style so different from every past shopping list, birthday card, or departmental memo they'd compared from her years of service? If it was someone else, why risk communicating at all? Who needed to create the illusion of justified payback? In the neighborhood, late-night lights burned as neighbors picked apart every memory, clutching their own theories like heirlooms. Mrs. Simmons, 3 doors down, claimed she'd seen a strange pickup cruising the road 2 nights before the body was found, its headlights dimmed and its plates cloaked in mud. The recollection was met with skepticism. She had been known to mix up dates and details, but her insistence shook the foundation of certainty even further. Soon others recalled flickers of movement on the periphery, slamming doors, hushed voices outside the old barn. Little by little, the seemingly airtight case frayed in the hands of those unable to settle for simple answers. As doubt spread, more questions mounted. The cement used to seal the trough was a brand rarely stocked in the local hardware store. Inventory records didn't perfectly align with the timeline of purchases attributed to Chelsea. Surveillance cameras captured a figure, impossibly blurred, hunched, and moving with the cautious rhythm of someone hiding more than a body, at the rear entrance of the farm supply shop, after hours. Was it her, or another, familiar with small-town routines and blind spots alike? Some even speculated about old vendettas dating back to land disputes, secret affairs, or retaliation for Chelsea's whistleblowing within the sheriff's department. Each theory, built on uncertainties and half-truths, only multiplied the mountain of unsolved riddles. The media ran wild. Everyone from distant relatives to internet sleuths weighed in, combing through decades of forgotten grievances and unexplained grudges, desperate to find what the official story had missed. Yet the most heartbreaking doubts came from those closest to the case. Dak's son, shuttling between grief counselors and distant relatives, struggled to reconcile the daunting public narrative with the private memories of his father. A quiet strength, a love for outlandish birds, a tolerance nicked with sadness but never violence. Who could really know what happened that night? He whispered to his notebook, the lines shaky where tears blurred the ink. Did I ever really know him at all? Chelsea, too, felt haunted by hundreds of unfinished conversations and missed moments, her own self-questioning now feeding the whirlpool of doubt. Though acquitted and then condemned in an endless legal carousel, she found herself waking in the middle of the night, piecing through every encounter, every slight, every anonymous glare on Main Street. Sometimes she wondered if even the dead could sense their stories had outgrown the facts that once seemed so solid. With every new angle explored, a new contradiction arose. The murder weapon, a handgun of common make, wiped clean, remained lost. No gunshot was heard the night Dak died, despite the fact that, in a town that small, the echo should have traveled for miles. Could a silencer have been used? Was the murder staged elsewhere and moved to the trough in dark secrecy? Or did someone close the windows and play the radio to mask the sound? Each possibility, no matter how improbable, found its believers. And so, in the months and years that followed, doubt became a ritual in Oglethorpe. The trial was over, the verdict rendered, then overturned, then retried. Still, at every wedding and funeral, every church, social, or high school football game, the case hung over conversations like the humidity itself. Each generation would inherit the story, pass it around, and turn it over in their hands as if hoping to feel something hidden beneath its surface. In the end, the mountains of doubt only grew steeper. In Oglethorpe, it turned out, truth was a labyrinth, not a line, a puzzle that rearranged itself every time you came close to a solution. And for every answer the case had given, there remained 10 more unanswerable mysteries, looming and shadowed, waiting for the next brave soul to start the hard climb all over again. The perpetual judgment of the courthouse. In the eyes of Oglethorpe, the courthouse had always been more than a building. It was a living theater, a confessional, and a battleground where reputations either survived the storm or were swept away in the downpour. Once, townsfolk believed its verdicts would be the last word, the final hand in life's endless game of poker. But the trial of Chelsea Forson shattered that old mythology, revealing instead how judgment could become a cycle, relentless as the seasons and far less merciful. Even after the jury's first verdict, one born of months of deliberation, reams of evidence and voices both trembling and steadfast, the town would not find peace. Chelsea Forson was acquitted, her lawyer celebrated in the press, her supporters weeping with relief on the sunny courthouse steps. But in the shade, behind the hedges and under the baseball caps pulled low against the sun, suspicion continued to coil and writhe. To some, the trial's outcome was an affront to decency, a sign that justice had been outplayed by cunning, charisma, or connections. To others, it was a shining moment of truth, proof that the innocent could prevail, even against an avalanche of presumption and bias. The Forson verdict didn't settle the story, it only opened a fresh wound. Whispers clung to Chelsea in every store aisle and church pew. Old classmates, Sunday school friends, and former partners all became judges and jurors in the court of daily rumor. Her daughter, once shielded by the badge's promise of respect, now shouldered the invisible scars of innuendo. So insidious it followed her for years, shaping who she trusted and how fiercely she clung to her mother's hand. For Chelsea herself, each morning felt like a new trial. She woke to accusations scrawled on bathroom mirrors, glances sharp as thrown stones, the hard certainty that acquittal was not redemption. But the cycle of judgment was slow to run its course. Months after the first verdict, an anonymous tip placed the case in the hands of state officials. New analysts, far removed from the town's rivalries and allegiances, combed through every old box of evidence. Painstakingly, almost mechanically. They measured tire tracks with fresh skepticism, interviewed hardware store clerks whose stories had subtly shifted, and asked uncomfortable questions about a pair of gloves still bagged in police evidence. Flaws in the prosecution's case emerged, but so too did hints at the defense's omissions. A receipt for gasoline, unaccounted mileage on Chelsea's car, a blurred surveillance glimpse of a second figure on that shadow-haunted night. Maybe, some thought, the jury had been right. And maybe not. It was enough to justify a retrial. This time the proceedings unspooled with the cold precision of a needle sewing shut a wound that refused to heal. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. News vans idling on Main Street, locals crowding every row, some driven by curiosity, others by a desperate need to see closure, any closure, wrenched from the chaos. Every gesture, every hesitation was reinterpreted, broadcast on regional news, magnified by social media commentary from far beyond Georgia. Before the bench, Chelsea faced a new array of cross-examiners and tactical accusations. Distant experts, unfamiliar with Oglethorpe's slow drawl but armed with clinical logic, presented charts and chemical analyses, speculated on time-of-death windows, and traced phone pings with surgical accuracy. Prosecutors reconstructed the night of the murder in excruciating detail. Tire marks mapped with laser precision, muddy boots analyzed for unique treads, purchase history collated and read aloud like gospel. The defense countered with its own experts, painstakingly deconstructing timelines, casting doubt on the reliability of memory under stress, and highlighting the absence of direct witnesses or a murder weapon conclusively tied to Chelsea's hand. But if the facts were the same, the atmosphere was not. The mood had curdled. Hushed hostility hung in the air, not just against Chelsea, but against the process itself. To some, the retrial was vengeance masquerading as justice. To others, an overdue reckoning that might finally lay the town's ghosts to rest. Jurors, newly selected from both Oglethorpe and neighboring counties, sat as impassive as blank gravestones, each bearing the knowledge that their decision would define not just one life, but the community's fragile self-image for decades to come. Testimony blurred into a parade of contradictions. One neighbor described seeing Chelsea's car parked near the Wilkins Ranch just before dawn on the day Dak Benton's body was discovered. Another, stout and bitter, swore she'd seen Chelsea at home all night, watering her tomatoes and humming along to the radio. A retired state trooper who'd once arrested Dak for brawling testified that the man could fight off a bear, and would, if cornered. The implication was clear. It would take more than anger or opportunity to subdue a man like that alone. The next day, a pathologist opined, with trademark detachment, that the wounds were consistent with a struggle, possibly involving more than one perpetrator, though it was not impossible for a single determined assailant to prevail. Each fact pressed against its twin, leaving the jury with nothing solid to grasp except the burden of their own judgment. Legal teams sparred not just over evidence but over narrative. Prosecutors painted Chelsea as both too strong and too vulnerable, driven by a wounded pride and an outsized sense of grievance, yet desperate enough to mask her deeds behind meticulous planning. Her attorney, by contrast, emphasized the patchwork of gaps, the convenience of her being the prime suspect, the threat she posed to old power structures in the police department, and the ease with which an investigation could tip from pursuit of truth into confirmation of prejudice. The retrial became a battle of perception and persuasion, unfolding in sharp whispers and steely-eyed rebuttals, every concession seized as a victory, every stumble magnified into suspicion. And all the while, the courthouse walls seemed to breathe with the town's collective anxiety. Morning saw lines of spectators clutching foam coffee cups, rehearsing theories under their breath, and rehashing every known detail. The afternoons belonged to the media, who hunted for any flicker of drama, a tearful embrace, an angry outburst, a hint of division among the families. Evenings, as the streetlights winked on over Main Street, old men and women gathered in the courthouse square, worrying at the puzzle like dogs with an old bone. For all its formal gravity, the process inched at the pace of rumor and pain. Eventually, after weeks wore down both nerves and rhetoric, the verdict came, not a surprise perhaps, but not a relief either. The jury, narrowing their eyes at the mountain of circumstantial evidence, the inconsistencies in stories, the relentless swirl of doubt, found Chelsea Forson guilty. The sentence: life in prison. The sound of the gavel was anticlimactic, more an echo than a bang in the tense, exhausted silence that followed. There were no cheers, no closure, just a heavy, stunned quiet, as if the courthouse itself was mourning the answer it was forced to give. Outside, night fell in slow waves over Oglethorpe. Neighbors who had been allies became wary strangers again, each unsure if truth had triumphed, or if the system, hungry for resolution, had merely folded beneath the weight of uncertainty. Some said that, with the verdict rendered, maybe their town could finally heal. Others felt a raw, contradictory ache, as if the true guilty party had slipped away through the cracks in the floorboards, leaving only a scapegoat and a battered legacy behind. But judgment, in Oglethorpe, would never be so simple or so finished. The flames of gossip burned on, stories twisting and hardening as years passed. New evidence was rumored to have surfaced, the hint of a confession, a forgotten fingerprint, GPS data from an unexamined phone. Every detail, every whisper, threatened to pull the case into yet another cycle of appeals and investigations. Chelsea, now an emblem of both defiance and tragedy, became a cautionary tale for some, a martyr for others, and an insoluble riddle for all. The perpetual judgment of the courthouse had left a scar not only on its records, but on every life it touched. A verdict was given, the law had spoken, but in this patch of southern soil, justice remained as elusive and restless as ever, spinning in its cycle, a lesson in the limits of certainty, the danger of conviction, and the endless shadow that doubt could cast over even the brightest summer day. Justice, a game of chance. A decade slipped away in the small, fever-bright orbit of Oglethorpe, and with it faded the hope that truth would ever be simple or unassailable. The courthouse's verdict had been etched in black and white across state records, but in the lived reality that followed, those boundaries melted into 1,000 shades of doubt and regret. Chelsea Forson remained behind bars, her appeals repeatedly denied, her name muttered with both sympathy and suspicion on the lips of former friends, strangers, and old adversaries. The deeper one gazed into the story of Dak Benton's death, the more the idea of justice felt less like a destination and more like a game of chance. Unforgiving, favoring luck and timing over simple rightness. For Chelsea, each passing year within the penitentiary walls was a spiral of hope and despair. She wrote letter after letter, to appellate courts, to innocence projects, to the rare journalists who had not yet decided what story they wanted to tell. The world outside changed. New roads, new faces, a crop of local officials who saw her case as either a closed chapter or a dangerous live wire not to be touched. Her daughter grew up amidst glances that were half pity, half fear. Her own mother wore her grief with a hard edge, clutching at every legal technicality that might bring her daughter home. But the rhythm of the legal system was cold and mechanical, each appeal processed, cited, and dismissed by courts whose distance measured both miles and empathy. No new evidence, no miscarriage of procedure, no reason to disturb the jury's finding. The phrase became a refrain, pounded into the paper of court orders until it lost all meaning for those who read it in the weary light of each new year. Meanwhile, beyond prison gates, the puzzle never quite resolved itself. Reporters, some driven by ambition, others by an ache for meaning, returned on anniversaries, crafting think pieces about the case's spectral grip on the town's sense of security. Law professors cited Chelsea v. State in seminars about the limits of circumstantial evidence. Defense attorneys pointed out the troubling tendency for the system to settle for tidy closure, even if the puzzle's missing pieces had been hastily swept beneath the rug. The judge who presided over her trial quietly retired, troubled by the knowledge that consensus and truth had never truly aligned in the fog of the Oglethorpe tragedy. Forensic experts brought in years later with new funding and better equipment found subtle discrepancies in the evidence that once seemed rock solid. A degraded DNA profile possibly signaling contamination, untraceable boot prints, a timeline just out of reach of certainty. But progress was slow and support fragmented. Fresh motions filed on Chelsea's behalf cited scientific inconsistency, yet every promising thread seemed to end at the same stone wall. Not material enough to alter the outcome. To the families enmeshed in the tragedy, justice became an elusive, shape-shifting adversary. Dak Benton's relatives found no peace in the conviction, only the slow erosion of unity, as old arguments about what really happened were reignited at every holiday table. Chelsea's mother sometimes braved the radio call-in shows or town meetings, her voice raw as she begged for empathy in a room that wanted only triumph or amnesia. Both families, in their own way, became actors in a cruel game, each move shaped by memory, rumor, and a profound lack of resolution. Throughout Oglethorpe, a climate of unease settled into the marrow of daily life. The verdict had failed to cleanse the stain of uncertainty. If anything, it made every act of kindness or suspicion more pointed. Young people who had once idolized the mystique of the badge now eyed authority with skepticism. Priests and preachers, desperate to comfort their flocks, struggled to answer the questions whispered in pews. What if the innocent can be condemned? What if the guilty still walk free? The county's brightest once debated careers in law, but more and more, the best minds left for distant cities rather than risk being consumed by the same quicksand that swallowed Chelsea and Dak. Legal scholars who reviewed the case often returned to its most damning contradiction, that justice, for all its rituals and incantations, was still a human enterprise, one where certainty was rare and the shadows always threatened to overrun the best-laid plans. Juries acted as both guardians and gamblers, sometimes led by charisma or fear rather than pure logic. Lawyers, for all their skill, knew how little it sometimes mattered in the face of public thirst for closure. In Oglethorpe, every neighbor learned that nothing is ever quite as settled as a gavel's fall might promise. Perhaps in the end, that was the most painful lesson, that justice in this place was not a verdict but a wager. When fate and fairness collided on the lonely backroads of Georgia, the balance rarely landed cleanly on one side or the other. Luck, bias, exhaustion, and the desire for an end all conspired to turn the pursuit of justice into something capricious, a roll of the dice with each new generation inheriting the old debts. The echoes of the case, its mysteries, rumors, and unfinished threads, became the town's inheritance, a legacy of questions haunting every judgment handed down in the years to come. Open ending, a mystery without resolution. Beneath the cobalt sky and endless pine groves, Oglethorpe has quietly aged with its wounds, the mystery of Dak Benton forever braided into the town's scarred history. With the case officially closed, yet endlessly reopened in conversation and memory, life settled back into its rituals, but every ritual now hummed with disquiet, every silence swollen with what was left unspoken. The blue house on the edge of town remains, cradling wild birds whose song is softer, more uncertain, echoing the unresolved questions that still haunt the community. As time stretched, the haunting transformed. What once was a sharp, gnawing pain now drifted across Oglethorpe like autumn fog. The courthouse, once a theater of shattered dreams and contested truths, returned to mediating small disputes, local quarrels. And still, at every gathering, from county fairs to church suppers to somber anniversaries, a single name, a half-whispered theory, or the dread phrase, the never-ending case, would slip through the hush and rearrange the room's temperature in an instant. No one forgot the trial's aftermath. Chelsea's name sparked arguments and uneasy quiet decades after. The paradox was clear. She lived on in stories as both a warning and a martyr, her fate frozen somewhere between justice and fate's whim. Dak's son, growing older and more like the father he mourned every year, found ways to live with ambiguity. He kept letters, old photos, family recipes, and pages torn from spiral notebooks where Dak had once cataloged the parrot's bright names. He sometimes drove out to the Wilkins Ranch, parking beneath the sycamore trees and staring at the field where loss had intersected with concrete certainty and left nothing but shadows. Rumors, instead of fading, seemed to crystallize over time. Each new generation adopted the mystery, spinning its own versions late into humid nights. A shadowy stranger from out of state, a vengeance scheme, a secret pact among townsfolk who silently conspired to protect one of their own, or perhaps even a tragic error covered up by those so desperate to maintain Oglethorpe's fragile reputation. The details grew fantastical, then sobered again, always anchored to the winding backroads and faded storefronts that gave the town its shape. Anyone who came seeking resolution left with only more questions. The old-timers insisted on the likelihood of a conspiracy. Nobody acts alone in a place like this. Journalists who had once set up camp near the Blue House, chasing exclusive interviews and shocking new evidence, found themselves chasing circles, every promising lead curling back on itself. Digital detectives, years and states away, picked apart case files, surveillance photos, and timelines, each clue tending to contradict more than confirm. When the verdict was overruled, then reinstated, then questioned once again, the uncertainty calcified into something resembling local lore, at once distant and persistent, like the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in a quiet house. The families moved through their lives with constant reminders that every conclusion was provisional, every rumor capable of fresh harm. Dak's ex-wife eventually left town for good, unable to escape the orbit of relentless speculation. Chelsea, whether within prison walls or fighting for her name from afar, came to symbolize not just a single crime, but a broader indictment of the system, how swiftly a life could pivot from law enforcement to scapegoat, from friend to pariah. For every person who believed unwaveringly in her guilt or innocence, there were twice as many who simply could not say, having weighed the facts against the backdrop of their own fears and half-remembered anxieties. So Oglethorpe learned to live with not knowing. Even as seasons shifted, sunflowers bowing in late summer heat, courthouse bricks darkening with spring rain, the mystery itself became a kind of tradition, a secret handshake, a cautionary tale for young deputies, a point of nervous laughter on stormy nights. The memory of Dak Benton faded not into closure, but into caution. He became a ghost woven into traffic noise, the hum of distant train whistles, the hush after distant thunder. Justice, or the lack of it, lost its sharpness and became something altogether more familiar and spectral, an acceptance that closure is sometimes just another version of denial. The unanswered questions weren't just a legacy, they shaped the very way the town imagined the world. Every locked door at dusk, every sideways glance, every small act of kindness offered too quickly or withheld too long, all carried echoes of that old, stale uncertainty. The Blue House with its chattering birds never quite regained its innocence. Children dared each other to peek through the sagging fence, swearing they saw shadows in the windows after midnight. The Wilkins Ranch, too, found itself marked, not by ghosts, perhaps, but by an irreversible feeling that something in the soil itself refused to rest. In the end, this perpetual mystery became the real inheritance of Oglethorpe. The facts, stretched and battered by versions, could never quite land on solid ground. Perhaps in some strange way the lack of an answer told its own story, one far truer to the complicated heart of the South than any neat confession or simple villain ever could. Justice in this town isn't a single event or decree, it is the tension, the longing, the ache of a story always just out of reach, reshaping itself around every new retelling, demanding humility and above all, an uneasy peace with not knowing. So life wanders onward, branching into new hopes and old habits as the sun rises over mute fields and time layers fresh secrets on top of old. The unanswered mystery lingers in the air, and in that perhaps lies a kind of resolution, one that fits the world not as we wish it, but as we find it, full of half-seen truths and questions that wait in patient shadow for those brave or foolish enough to ask them again.